So here we are again today, and we are continuing with our chapter on controlling fullness. And today we are going to do gathering. Right? There's a few different types of gathering that we would be focusing on today. And the first one is a normal gathering, like what you would use for a skirt, uh, um, a gathered skirt, or maybe a gathered sleeve. So, first of all, when you are gathering, you need to have twice, at least twice the amount of fabric to be gathered for that space that you want to gather. So, say I want to put on a gathered piece of fabric onto this, I would need twice the amount of fabric. So, I would actually need this amount of fabric to be gathered onto this. Okay, now that rule actually changes a bit according to the type of fabric. So if you have a very fine fabric, we could go up to 3 times the amount of fabric, right, to be gathered. Okay, because it will be fine and will be able to gather and come in and look pretty nice with a finer fabric. With a thicker fabric, if you have a very thick fabric, you may need to only go like about 1.5 times. Okay, so it varies, but on a normal basis, what we will deal with, what we would work with, is twice. So we have this piece of fabric, we want to gather a piece of fabric onto it, so we have twice the amount. Okay, so first of all, we have to deal with the piece of fabric that we are going to be gathering. Okay, and what I have here, I'm hoping that you can see it. I have my stitching line. Okay, and what we will be doing is putting 2 stitches, one above the stitching line, just above the stitching line here, and one just below the stitching line. The one just below the stitching line will be removed later on. Okay, now when we are going to do gathers, we open up the stitches a bit. We want to have a longer stitch length so that when we want to remove that stitch that we put in for the gathers, we can remove it easily. So we will have a longer stitch length. It will also help to gather the fabric easier. So first of all, I'm going to put in my stitches and I'll show you one above and one below. So here goes. So I'm going just below, and as I said, I want to open up my stitches a bit, so I will this now. I'll open up my stitches a bit here, and right, so I got my stitches opened up, and now I can start stitching. We do not back stitch. We're going to just start stitching because we don't want to tie the edges. Remember, we need to be able to pull those threads later on. We will be able to pull the threads. So I have my first stitch in, and if you notice, it is just below that stitching line that I have that is marked off. And now I'm going to do another stitch just above it. Reason being that when we pull the stitches, these 2 rows of stitches would help to keep the fabric sitting flat while you attach it to the other piece of fabric that you want your gathers to be on. So I have my 2 rows of stitching here now, one above the stitching line and one below it. I am really hoping that you can see the stitching line. The stitching line is in between these 2 stitches here. Okay, right. So now I'm going to take one side of it, and all the threads I can wrap them around a pin here and then pin it into the edge. And the reason why I'm just wrapping the threads around the pin is kind of like to tie it off a little bit, so that when I pull from this side it wouldn't just pull out. Okay, so we do that, and we start now with the threads from the other end. You can take a pin, and we take the 2 top threads, only the top threads. So you see I pull them out, 2 top threads, hold them together like that, and I start to pull, and I start to work my gathers. Now you have to be careful with this, because what you can do too is burst the thread. So first of all, you have to have good thread. Make sure your thread is strong. Maybe you can test it before you start. Okay, and then you gently, I have to put this where you can see. So I gently keep working the gathers down. Okay, so I keep pulling here and keep working the gathers all the way down. Keep pulling here again and working the gathers all the way down to the end. And we want to try and keep the gathers even too. We want to have all the gathers even right through to the end. So you would take a look at it and shuffle the gathers around as you need to. Notice I'm having my gathers done here now. And what I will do is measure it against my piece of fabric that I want to put it on. And if you notice, right now I have pulled it a little too much, so I can slacken off a bit. Right? I need to slacken it off a little bit so that it can reach the end. So I can pull back on some of the gathers, slacken it until I get it end to end. Alright? So when I have it end to end now, it's fitting end to end, I can now tie off this end of my thread so that it would not go any further, it would not pull back out or tighten any further. So I am going to tie off my thread end, or you can just wrap it around the pin the same way too. Right, so now I can adjust my gathers so that all the gathers are even. Right, so I adjusted my gathers. Make sure they don't make pleats. You don't want the gathers to make pleats, and that is the reason why we have 2 stitches here. Now what will happen is that the 2 stitches that we have here will hold the gathers in place nicely for you to stitch in between that. Now remember, your stitching line was in between here, so that is where you're going to be stitching now. You're going to be stitching in between there, and it would cause the gathers to stay nice and as gathers instead of getting pleated, because sometimes what will happen is that you'll be stitching and you'll stitch over a gather like this, and it turns into a pleat instead of a gather, and it doesn't look good. So when you have the double stitching line there, you'll find yourself stitching over the gathers in a pretty uniform fashion. If you notice, right in the middle there, you can see that the gathers can't pleat or anything like that, so you can stitch there comfortably now. So that's what we're going to do now. I'm going to put it onto the other piece of fabric that we wanted to stitch it onto. So say this was a skirt that you were making, alright? Say this was a skirt you were making. The other piece of fabric there would have been the waistband, okay? If it was going onto a dress, this would have been the top part of the dress, and let me show you here. Sorry that I didn't move that. So now I am stitching in between, in between, and I can stitch here, make sure that I am even with the top of the thing. And if you notice it loosen out a bit, so I can now shift it down, shift down my gathers. Alright, to shift them down evenly so that the end of the fabric would match. So let's back stitch at this point and take it off. Now the threads that I had, now let me show you this. What would happen is that you'd be seeing one of the lines of stitching here. You're seeing that there. So that is the one that we want to pull out now. Right? That was just there as a guide to keep our gathers nice and neat. Okay? So what we will do is pull out the bottom row of stitches now that we had for gathering. And because this is a bit loose, remember I told you open up your stitches so that when you're ready to remove it, it can come out easily. So now I've removed it, and you see we have a nice set of gathers. They're not pleating, they are gathers, and they fell nicely. The opposite side, we have all the stitching. You can see the stitching on the opposite side. We don't have to remove the top stitch because that is on the inside. That's on the wrong side of the garment. So we don't need to do the top one. We just needed to do the bottom one that we had as a guide. But you see how nice and neat the gathers are.